Hey everybody, I hope you had a great 3-day long weekend and you're ready to get back to the grind today. Now we're starting full force toward our first essay, and there's lots of information that you're going to be presented with over the next week or so. I believe for most classes, the first essay is going to be due around September 22nd. This is a general video lecture for everybody, since some classes didn't get to meet this week since they meet on Mondays and many of you are online students. So I'm just going to try to, cast a wide net and talk about some big issues with compositions today. That's what this lecture is about. And I may split it up into parts. So this first lecture, I'm actually going to focus on something called How to Say Nothing in 500 Words. I've sent this to everybody now, or it's already available under the modules for you to look at. This is by a fantastic author, Paul McHenry Roberts, who lived for 50 years, 1917 to 1967, and taught college English for over 20 of those years. So he was pretty much an expert in the field. This essay has been published a number of times throughout the years. It is a bit antiquated in that it refers to things like typewriters. I doubt many of you still use typewriters. But despite that, it does have some ideas that are really relevant to what you will do in my class and in future classes. Whether you're in Comp 1 or Comp 2, I know some of my Comp 2 students haven't had a chance to look at this. I don't think many of the other teachers in Comp 1 use this. But the Comp 1 students definitely will look at this with me. And this has been assigned. So the first thing I want to say is that this text is not, I repeat, this is not an anti-football text. That's a very important thing to say in this region of the country. A lot of students don't read it very deeply, and they look at the first part, which is actually called an anecdote, a story that illustrates a point. And this type of anecdote is hypothetical. What that means is that it's an invented story. What Roberts has done is created this kind of model student based on every student he's encountered in the past. He's taken a gross generalization, which is normally a very bad thing to do, but he's taken this generalization of all his experiences over 20 years and created this kind of model of what a typical college student would have been doing in the 50s. But it's not dissimilar from what many of us do. So the students don't read that story very deeply and see it for what it is, which is a story to illustrate our writing process, our typical writing process as college students. So as college students, we normally do something that's really, really detrimental for good writing. We procrastinate. And I'm sure many of you can sympathize with that idea. In fact, I already can tell many of you can, because I've noticed that with the diagnostic essays or the practice interview essays, depending on what section you were in, many of you didn't turn anything in until literally hours before it was due, which presented some problems, and some of you had some technical issues with that. Some of you turned in something that was literally one paragraph, which you know is not an essay. You know darn well that one paragraph is not an essay. But you also probably thought, he's not really grading this very strictly, so I'll just throw something together in the last 30 minutes. I'm tired. I worked 50 hours, blah, blah, blah. The reality of contemporary college life. If this goes dark from time to time, my screensaver pops up and I have to hit the mouse to move it. So don't freak out. The video's still going on. Okay, so here's the thing. The story is very much an illustration of us. And also of some of the stereotypical topics we often come across in comp classes, things that really aren't that important to us, like college football. I mean, they're important to us, but I imagine the vast majority of my students are pro college football. Probably pretty excited that this past weekend, I think, was the first weekend of the season. and watch a number of the games. And what's funny here is this essay that the student chooses to write. He writes it, and I'm using the he because that's what the author uses. He writes it in order to please what he thinks the teacher wants, the professor wants, when in fact the professor shows up at the football game and doesn't seem to have any strong views for or against the concept. He's probably teaching from an assigned reader himself. So that's something to think about, and I think that's probably the first most important lesson of this text we can pick up from this story, is that you should never try to write something just to please me or another professor or instructor. You should write something that you're passionate about. Sometimes you have to invent that passion, which gets me to the thesis of this essay. Now, a thesis is the main idea, main argument of any essay. Fiction, poetry, those things don't have thesis statements, but essays, articles, newspaper articles, those sorts of things typically do have some sort of thesis statement. There's very little that's in the media in this day and age that is not somehow presenting a very specific opinion. We sometimes call that bias, but bias isn't always a bad thing. Bias is only a bad thing when it's uninformed bias. Bias that's based on emotion in your gut and not based on research. And that's really one of the big concepts we're trying to get across to you in composition, that any opinion that you present to a public needs to be supported by research. In this case, the main idea, we're going to look at the research, which is the text. This is called primary source research. This is our primary source. We're going to look at the text. And the main idea comes in that paragraph, the bottom paragraph on the second page. And I want to read this to you because it's very important. Well, you may ask, I hate the fact that he uses second person, because I've been told since the beginning of my academic career you never use second person in an academic essay. But this isn't really an academic essay. This is an article for something like a composition anthology or like a textbook. It's not really something where you're presenting information that's been researched. You're presenting a very clear opinion. Well, you may ask, what can you do about it? Meaning, what can you do about writing something that you don't really care anything about? The subject is one on which you have few convictions and little information. Can you be expected to make a dull subject interesting? Again, he's using rhetorical questions. That's something you should never do in an academic paper, but it works for this sort of thing, which is more entertaining and informative than just informative. As a matter of fact, this is precisely what you are expected to do, and if you have a copy of the text, I want you to underline that sentence, because that is exactly what I'm expecting you to do. I'm expecting you to take a dull subject, a subject you may not give a whit about, a subject that is totally maybe outside of your realm of experience. I know for my Comp 2 students writing about poetry or literature, many of you do not like writing, are reading, and have mentioned that in your discussion posts, have mentioned that in emails to me. And many of you might love reading, but have only read for pleasure, never really read for analysis in the past, which is a very different process. And I know even me as a creative writer, I sometimes get really tense and angry about criticism, because it's like, how do they know what the writer wants? The writer knows what they want, which is a fallacy unto itself. The point of all that is you still have to write something, and you have to make it interesting. That's just it. You know, we have to write stuff all the time that's not interesting to us. It's part of being a member of this society. If you want to work in a profession, you're going to write memos, letters, instructions about things that should seem common sense, about things you don't really care about, and you're going to have to read things that you don't really care about. So it's important that you get used to this idea that it is your job, and the expectation of our society, that you create an interesting text. Not that I become interested in your text. but that you create an interesting text that is well researched and well supported and has a central thesis statement, a central argument that focuses the whole paper, okay? That's some of the most important aspects. You should be coming across that in your readings. I know that some of them early chapters deal with thesis statements in all the textbooks that y'all are looking at. Again, he goes on to say, this is the writer's essential task. All subjects, we'll skip that sentence for the time being. The writer's job, and this is the thesis statement, the writer's job, and you should underline it, is to find the argument, the approach, the angle, the wording that will take the reader with him. And you should say him or her, because, of course, we are non-gender specific. So, here's the thing. It is your job to find the argument, the approach, or the angle. Remember those three concepts. The argument, the approach, the angle, the wording. That's key, the wording that will take the reader with you on this journey, which is your essay. So, the reason I bring that up is a number of students ask me, well, what's the word count? How long should this thing be? Is it, and I do have some specifics on that. Sometimes I say it's between 500 and 800 words. The biggest rule I have is that all essays need to be at least 5 paragraphs. That's a minimum, not a maximum. And, I always get frustrated when students ask those questions because it's like, that doesn't matter. What matters is that you're doing this. What matters with your essays is that you are taking the approach, the angle, and the wording, the argument, that you're focused, that things are research-based, that your argument is not just something you thought up 2 hours before the essay was due and you whipped up some BS and you threw it on the paper and you sent it in. I want to see something that you're passionate enough about, or at least you're faking the passion enough about, that you've gone out and gotten some information about. That's why these early essays require interviews and internet research, depending on the class you're in, depending on the subject, reading some stories for my Comp 2 students because they're literature-based over here at Lamar. Things like that. Okay. So, we have to find an argument. That's where we start. Now, Roberts goes through and he gives us some key pointers, and I'm going to touch on each of those. The first thing I think is fascinating to me is this idea of avoiding the obvious content. And I really like how he says, write down everything you feel about the subject or you think is true about the subject, and then write about anything but that. I believe it was say something along the lines of, all right, now when you write your paper, make sure that you don't use any of the material on this list. So make a list of all the things you can brainstorm about this topic, and then throw the list out. Don't use it. Write about the not obvious content. Write about something interesting. For many of you, that's a challenge because you might not be familiar with the topic you're writing on. In which case, you're not going to know what the obvious content is. You're going to assume some things, but you're not really going to know. So, probably a better strategy would be to research. Research and see if you can find interesting information that's not obvious. Avoid statements like all, always, someone, everyone, anyone. That's stuff that you see in things that make writing teachers cringe, these hasty generalizations, because those show that you haven't really read any research, because research never says everyone feels this way. That's not very scientific now, is it? So go and find some information that makes your paper unique, and inevitably, if you do research, you'll come across information that's unique. Particularly interviews. People will see things differently than you if you're interviewing the right people. If you only interview people who are your friends, from your same social network, there's a good chance that they're going to see the world exactly as you do and share all the same opinions and many of the same experiences as you. That's not entirely true. It's not always true, but there's a very good chance. So I would be careful with that sort of thing and try to find people that are different enough from you to give you some good information. Now, connected to that is the idea of taking the less usual side. And his examples kind of frighten me a little bit about the dogs because I'm a fan of dogs. But that's actually an interesting paper if it's done correctly. So you can always argue against what you actually believe. Let's say you're pro football, but you want to argue that football should be abolished just as an experiment. Go out and find some research that supports that concept and then start arguing it just to see. Slip out of abstraction. He says, if you will study the essay on college football near the beginning of this essay, you will perceive that one reason for its appalling dullness, I love that phrase, appalling dullness, is that it never gets down to particulars, or what I call specifics. It is just a series of not very glittering generalities. Football is bad for the colleges. It has become too commercial. Football is big business. It is bad for the players, and so on. Such round phrases thudding against the reader's brain are unlikely to convince him or her, though they may well render him unconscious or her unconscious. If you want the reader to believe that college football is bad for the players, you have to do more than say so. That's a tough phrase to say sometimes. You have to display the evil. Okay, so I'm going to underline that because that's an important key point. You have to display the evil. You have to show that something's important. You can't tell me that it is important, because if you tell me it's important, I'm immediately going to shut down. And if you think about this, this makes perfect sense. I always use the analogy of when we're kids. Some of you may still be kids in some ways, but when we're kids and we're living at home and our parents tell us to do things like clean our room, wash the dishes, mow the lawn, all those chores people seem to hate when they're young. But when they grow up, they start to see the importance of. But when we're young, we do them not because we necessarily see that they're important. We might, but we do them because our parents tell us they're important. And all they say is, do as I say. Do it because I'm your parent. Do it because I told you to do it. Do it because it is important, and they leave it at that. Now, if you really think about it, to a kid, how convincing is that? You have to do this because I say it's important. My favorite phrase is, do as I say, not as I do. Ugh, horrible, right? Not very convincing, right? Because what convinces us? What makes us support an argument? Evidence. Every time. Solid evidence. And how do you get evidence for an essay? You interview people, you do field research, you go out and you find articles, you look at the internet, you find reliable sources that support your position and statistics that also support that position, and you use that. That will make your paper. So don't be abstract, be specific, give specific examples. That's what an illustration essay is, and that's our first mode, illustration or exemplification. Get rid of obvious padding. I'm going to let you read that yourselves because I'm running out of space here for the video, but that is hilarious because what it gets to is this idea of I have to make a word count. I have to make 500 words, and I don't know how to do it because I really have nothing to say and no confidence in what I'm saying. So the trick is to have confidence in what you're saying and to cite sources. Now, early on, for some of you, we're not going to do too much with sources and research. Some of you are doing a lot because you're in a more advanced class. So your research is really going to be field research for those of you in my Comp 1 courses. And my Comp 2 courses are looking at stories and thinking about that as their starting place. But your information needs to come from those texts. Call a fool, don't be timid. That means say what you mean. And then the sections on colored words and colorless words, I think, are very important. Of course, you have the colorful words and beware of pat expressions as well. My copy here, I've moved around a lot, so it's in different orders. Now, colorless words, colored words, and all that, that deals with vocabulary. And what I typically tell students when it comes to vocabulary is to pick interesting words, but pick words that you know the proper part of speech. You know you're using them correctly, so don't accidentally use a synonym for the word read. That's actually the verb form when you mean to use the noun form and that sort of thing. People do that all the time. So really be aware of the parts of speech before you use certain words. Read this essay. It's essential. And then when you are struggling with writing an essay, go back and think about these things. I can't overestimate how influential Roberts' essay has been on my own writing, particularly the idea of beware of pat expressions, of tightening your language. It's always better to say things in 5 words rather than 50 words if you can. That's a key concept I want you all to start thinking about. Your word count should come from valid examples and illustrations rather than vagaries. Okay? Alright, so I'm going to sign off because this has gotten to be a really large file and I'm going to have to upload it from work. I hope you find this mini lecture, interesting. Please read the essay. Please email me your questions, and let's start a really good week this week. I believe it's our 3rd, maybe even our 4th week of the semester. It's going by fast already, isn't it? And hope to hear from you soon.